my name's Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK hobby importers and distributors, and welcome to part 3. Now in part 3 we've moved forward to August 1944 and the United States Army, or technically the Army of the United States, in operations in France in 1944. So let's cover some organisation as it stood in 1944. As we've mentioned before, the senior soldier is General George C. Marshall. Now behind me I'm showing a picture of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe. That's armies, navies and air forces. Think of Ike as like a massive executive officer. Now Eisenhower was picked by Marshall against the advice of many other officers, a passed over colonel, to lead American forces in Europe, and then eventually, with the approval of FDR and the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, as the Supreme Allied Commander. Now, when we went to D-Day, it was, believe it or not, a mainly British and Canadian affair. So it was 21st Army Group, backed up on Omaha and Utah Beach by American 1st Army, commanded by Omaha Bradley. Now, once we got onto Normandy, the picture changed and more American forces were coming into Europe. Now, they needed a new organisation, so they formed 12th Army Group, US 12th Army Group, and it would be commanded by the former commander of 1st US Army, General Bradley. Now, he gave command of 1st Army to General Hodges. He also had a 9th US Army, commanded by General Simpson, and the 3rd US Army, commanded by one of the most famous of all American generals, George S. Patton. Then after mid-August 1944, when the Allies invaded southern France, a new army group, 6th Army Group, consisting of US 7th Army and French 1st Army, who were pushing the Germans out of southern France in what would be known as the Champagne Campaign. By the end of August 1944, like the British and the Canadians who were on the Seine, the Americans were also on the Seine, with General Patton's 3rd Army coming up from the south slightly, and he was pushing towards the Seine. The Americans then suffered the same kind of fate as the British and Canadians earlier on. The Germans simply faded away, up to the Low Countries and east towards the French-German border. So as 21st Army Group advanced really quickly, chasing the Germans in hot pursuit, the American 12th Army Group were pushing east. And by early September, around 5th or 6th September, they were up against the French-German border. The problem is, they've left all their supplies behind. 700,000 tons of supplies in Normandy, and with the start of what's called the supply crisis. But it actually isn't a supply crisis, it's a distribution crisis. It's just a matter of getting the supplies to the front lines. Now, because the port of Antwerp weren't open, they had to get somehow trucks, thousands of trucks, to run supplies all over the battlefield. So they literally had to strip 3 US infantry divisions of everything on wheels that could carry boxes, and anybody could drive a truck and put them onto the Red Ball Express. As we're talking about trucks driving all over France, they're going to consume vast amounts of fuel. There are 4 things when it comes to logistics in an army that can lose battles: lack of food, lack of water, lack of ammunition, and lack of fuel. So to help with this, a very expensive and complicated project was built prior to D-Day, and this was Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean. To give its actual title, it's Pipeline Underwater Transportation of Oil, but Pluto sounds zippy, so Pluto will use. This was a series of pipes running from the UK across to France. Initially, a pipe called Bambi that ran from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg. Now this system was supposed to deliver to the Allies some 5,000 tons of fuel a day. that by the 15th of September 1944, not a thimble full of fuel had got to the Allies via Pluto. Now later on, they would run another set of pipes from Dungeness in Kent over to the French coast as we moved further up the French coast and kicked the Germans out. And this would be Dumbo. Now Dumbo would run a lot shorter rather than the 260 miles running from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg. This was obviously a lot shorter, and 6 pipelines. So this moved a little bit better and moved a little bit more fuel, but nowhere near what the Allies needed. In fact, the Allies in northwest Europe consumed some 5 million tons of fuel, and Pluto, that delivered just 8%. What it needed was a port. Now, to get fuel, they're bringing them in what are called coastal tankers. In fact, they were bringing coastal tankers from all around the world to get to Britain to take fuel to these smaller ports where the Allies had got. But it wasn't until we got Antwerp operational at the end of November that we could put the massive sea tankers into Antwerp. But because Antwerp's been whacked by V1s and V2s, they're restricted to 1 large sea tanker a day. But this did help with the fuel crisis. Now, this is more of a tricky subject, and hopefully other people on YouTube and historians will bring this up, but I will bring it up. You cannot talk about the United States Army in Europe and Great Britain without talking about racial segregation. Now, the US Army had black units and white units, and none of the twain would meet. That would be their ideal situation for them. And in fact, there were many racial incidents in Great Britain during this period. In fact, we had to accept a form of apartheid called Jim Crow for us to accept the American forces into Britain and defeat the Germans. There's a number of incidents, including the number of murders of African American soldiers by white US Army soldiers. And in one famous incident in the village of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, where a local unit of the US Army, an African American unit, truck driving battalion, were trying to use the British public houses, and the Lancashire people were all welcoming these African American soldiers as brave young men coming over to Britain to help fight the Nazis. But the local white American soldiers didn't want nothing to do with this, resulting in a gun battle on UK streets of US Army soldiers fighting each other with their weapons, resulting in the death of 1 African American soldier and the rest of many more. But with uproar locally by local MPs and members of the Bamber Bridge community who came on the side of the African Americans, a lot of these charges were dropped. Now, as things got desperate in northwest Europe, this total segregation would start to fall apart. When times got desperate later in the war, especially in the Ardennes, this total segregation of the US Army units kind of disappeared a bit, and both white American soldiers and African American soldiers would end up fighting together. Got no choice. So you can imagine a young African American kid from Boston in the same trench as some young white kid from Little Rock, Arkansas. I'm afraid the prejudice had to be put aside, because what was coming through the forest were thousands of German soldiers, and they had to basically get rid of the Germans and worry about that later on. But in many ways, what happened in the Second World War and what happened with many of these famous African American units, such as the Tuskegee Airmen and the 761st Tank Battalion and many more units who showed incredible bravery in the Second World War, helped break down slowly these Jim Crow laws. And in 1947, the then new President Harry S. Truman, finally desegregated the United States military. Behind me, I'm showing a clip of one of the most famous American military vehicles of World War II, the GMC CCKW, basically known as the Jimmy or the Deuce and a Half. And as you can see, this truck's basic but incredibly effective. In fact, given a modern engine and modern brakes, this would work today, because in the end, it's green, it's a truck, and it's moving boxes from A to B over rough country. Now, the Red Ball Express would use thousands of these trucks, but for all the thousands the Americans produced, 600,000 of these trucks Not much more than 1% were in Normandy. There was simply not enough. That's why earlier on I said they were stripping US Army infantry divisions of all their vehicles. Now, what it required was about 7,000 trucks to run. And luckily, the CCKW, or the Deuce and a Half, was much easier to drive than a lot of British trucks. And therefore, with a few hours lessons, you could get somebody who could at least drive a car, learning to drive a truck, or even a tractor, and they could drive this truck. It was now that black and white American soldiers would have to work together for the first time, as the desperation of this distribution crisis required thousands of truck drivers to move supplies from the beaches of Normandy and up to the American front lines. I'm now going to show a clip from a 1950s movie called The Red Ball Express, starring one of the great 50s American movie stars, Jeff Chandler, and a very, very young Sidney Poitier as an African-American truck driver. In fact, I'm going to let Jeff Chandler, his character, explain to you now how the Red Ball Express will work. So let's Jeff take the story.
My name's Campbell. I know you're wondering what this is all about. The Army is setting up the biggest trucking detail in history. They're going to call it the Red Ball Express. It's an old railroad term meaning high priority freight. We're going to be part of it. Our orders are to load up, catch General Patton, unload, and then drive right back and do it all over again. Load, roll them, unload, roll them until we're dizzy. Well, there isn't anything I can add to that. These are our vehicles right behind us. 2 men to a truck. Mount up and follow me when we move out.
In part 4, we're going to look at 2 really tough battles that the American Army would fight before the Battle of the Bulge. This was the Battle of Aachen and the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, known to the soldiers as the Green Hell. I'll see you in part 4.